For decades, it was treated as dead space, worth mapping for rubble, not for meaning. The site lay under the government quarter of central Berlin, a stitched-together grid of basements and tunnels that had served, on paper, as shelters, storage, and emergency corridors during the last years of the war. In April 1945, it emptied in a rush. Staff fled, units broke apart, the city folded in on itself. Within weeks, Soviet engineers sealed entrances, pumped out some sections, and left others to flood. The official story stayed simple: unstable ground, lingering hazards, no strategic value. And yet, one line in an Allied technical note refuses to sit quietly. It doesn't describe beds, rations, or triage rooms. It lists paired copper conduits anchored along a corridor ceiling, routed into a walled chamber that did not appear on captured plans. The note adds a detail that reads like a careless afterthought. The conduits were fitted with ceramic standoffs, spaced with the kind of precision you use when you expect heat, vibration, or electrical interference. The same page mentions a cabinet frame bolted to the floor. No drawers, no labels, only a plate with 2 screw holes where a name should have been. Nothing about that fits a shelter that was supposedly abandoned in the final collapse. Later inventories summarize the tunnels in broad strokes: collapsed passages, soot, water damage. The conduits are never mentioned again. The chamber becomes a blocked recess. The cabinet turns into debris. In public accounts, the detail evaporates as if it had been smudged out with a thumb. No correction appears, no explanation is offered, and no one officially circles back to why a corridor under a dying regime carried equipment installed with such care. If it was only a bunker, why did someone bother to build a room that wasn't on the plans, and wire it like it had to keep working, even while the city above was burning? The moment they chipped through the later brickwork, the air changed. Cooler, metallic, with the stale bite of wet concrete that hadn't breathed since the war. A narrow service passage opened first, then a low room where the ceiling dipped like it had been forced to make space for something heavy. On the floor, half sunk in silt, lay a section of rack rail, standard steel, but drilled with an odd, repeated pattern, as if it had held modules that needed exact spacing. Nearby, a bundle of copper cable ran through glazed ceramic standoffs, each standoff stamped with a tiny manufacturer's mark and a year, 1944. The copper wasn't thin house wiring, it was thick, multi-strand, wrapped in cloth insulation and lacquered like equipment meant to endure heat. At the far wall, a panel box remained bolted in place. Its door was gone. Inside were terminal posts, numbered in neat black ink with no corresponding labels, just numbers, as if the meaning lived somewhere else. One object looked almost mundane, until you held it. A fragment of glass tubing, browned at one end, with a brass collar and a faint residue that left a bitter smell on the glove. Not medical, not plumbing. Something built to carry pressure or current without leaking. For 1945 Berlin, that combination raises practical questions. Shelters used simple power lines, crude pumps, field phones. They didn't need insulated copper runs mounted on ceramic spacers at regular intervals. They didn't need numbered terminal arrays without names. They didn't mount racks into the floor unless the load mattered, unless vibration or movement could ruin whatever was housed there. The contradictions stack quickly, and they don't resolve. A Soviet field report lists the corridor as cleared in May 1945, yet the brickwork that sealed the chamber contains mortar consistent with later mixes, post-war, not wartime. A set of handwritten notes by a German site electrician places new feed lines in February 1945, but the plans archived in the same folder show no additions after 1943. An Allied summary calls the room empty, while a separate equipment log, 2 pages, no signature. records removal of 2 cabinets from a location that matches the chamber's dimensions. None of this proves a single story. It does suggest something else. There were programs known to very few, projects with overlapping names and shifting covers, where an object could be officially storage and privately something more exacting. A place could be declared useless and still be handled with careful hands. So, what was the numbered panel for? Who needed connections that couldn't be spoken aloud? And if it was nothing, why do the dates, the mortar, and the missing cabinets keep disagreeing in the same direction? Once the fragments are laid side by side, the official explanation stops being sufficient, not because it is false, but because it is too small. Researchers who tried to reconcile the dates, the hardware, and the altered masonry found themselves stepping beyond what post-war summaries were designed to explain, not into rumor, but into gaps left by deliberate omission. The gaps have a pattern. Files referenced in correspondence are absent from the folders that should contain them. Equipment lists end mid-sentence, followed by blank pages where appendices were once stapled. Names of technicians appear in payroll records through early 1945, then vanish. No transfers, no deaths, simply no further trace. Across Allied and Soviet archives alike, the same silence repeats. The absence of data begins to feel as intentional as any stamp or signature. Some testimony survived, but it never found a home in the official line. A Soviet signals officer, interviewed decades later, recalled guarding a lower level with no windows and no markings, where work continued at night under portable lamps long after the area was declared secure. A German electrician's private notebook mentions restricted cabinets that could not be opened without written authorization that never appears elsewhere. None of these accounts were disproven. They were simply left unfiled. From this terrain, a few restrained theories emerge. One suggests the chambers supported experimental power regulation, an attempt to stabilize sensitive systems underground as surface infrastructure collapsed. The ceramic standoffs, the heavy copper, the vibration-anchored racks all align with that function. It was never acknowledged because the effort failed, and failure leaves an inconvenient paper trail. Another points to secure communications testing, isolated from the city's failing grid. Numbered terminals without labels make sense if connections changed frequently, and secrecy mattered more than clarity. Such work would explain why equipment was removed quickly and without ceremony. A third theory stays closer to logistics. The space may have served as a controlled environment for calibrating devices too delicate for frontline conditions. Not weapons, but instruments, tools whose value lay in precision. That kind of work rarely earns a place in simplified histories. What all theories share is not drama, but discretion. The deeper levels reinforce it. Narrow stairwells that lead nowhere. Locked steel doors behind unmarked walls. Rooms where the floor bears scars of heavy mounts, but the mounts themselves are gone. In these spaces, sound dies quickly. Even footsteps seem managed. If any of these explanations approach the truth, then something had to follow the war, something quiet, efficient, and final, to ensure those traces did not linger where questions could grow. After the fighting ended, the site did not linger in debate. Decisions came fast. Entrances were sealed with poured concrete. Pumps were installed only long enough to drain selected sections, then removed. Other levels were allowed to fill with groundwater, a passive erasure that required no guards and left little to document. Access became conditional, then restricted, then quietly discontinued. In later years, the space was referred to only as stabilized underground, a phrase that explains nothing and invites no questions. What disappeared did so unevenly. Heavy cabinets recorded in removal logs never appear in depot inventories. Electrical components described in early surveys are absent from museum collections and technical repositories. Entire corridor segments, visible in wartime sketches, no longer match the dimensions of surviving maps. Later descriptions simply omit them. In the language of reports, they were never there. One item surfaced much later, without ceremony. In the 1990s, a private archive released a contact sheet of photographs taken by an Allied engineering unit during initial inspections. Most images show collapsed masonry and flooded floors. One frame, poorly lit and never enlarged, captures a wall panel with numbered terminals, clean, intact, and unmistakably in use at the time. No caption explains it. No follow-up analysis was published. The image was catalogued and forgotten. Official history remains firm and brief. The tunnels were obsolete. The installations were improvised. Nothing of consequence occurred there after the final weeks of the war. The matter is considered closed. And yet, the record still doesn't account for the precision of the wiring, the care of the construction, the speed of the removals, or the consistency of what went missing. It doesn't explain why later efforts focused not on preservation or study, but on disappearance. Perhaps the most important elements were never recovered. Or perhaps they were recovered so thoroughly that only their absence remains, embedded in sealed chambers, flooded corridors, and the quiet agreement of documents that stop just short of saying too much. The site still exists beneath the city, unchanged in its silence, holding no answers, only the shape of questions that were never meant to survive.